Hey guys, it's Bible Scribe. Thank you for joining me once again. We're going to talk today about the first and second resurrection. Now, I was, of course, as always, doing study on other things, not even focused specifically on this. And of course, run across just one thing after another, just blowing my mind. But this particular thing is amazing because of all the years I've studied prophecy, for one, I've never had anyone that could sufficiently explain to me what the first resurrection was and the second resurrection that's mentioned in Revelation chapter 20. But I am happy to say I think that I now understand what those two things are, or at least have a good hunch. So this is a working theory for me that I am going to present to you because it's so powerful. It's so important, I think, to understand. So I want other people's input on this theory. I want to know what you think if you after you hear this. So I'm going to share with you what I found, and it to me it's important because this theory makes sense in every way that I can possibly look at the text of Revelation and prophecy in general. It all makes sense with this interpretation of what the first resurrection and the second resurrection really are. So let's get into it. I'll try to share this with you in a way that kind of leads you to it and makes sense. Let's start just by looking at Revelation chapter 20, which you have on the screen before you. I won't read all of this word for word, but we'll go through a few things just to get our bearings. Verse 1, I saw an angel come down from heaven. He has the key to Hades and the chain in his hand. He lays hold of the dragon, the serpent, the devil, and Satan. This is who we're talking about. We don't need to be confused. He takes Satan and binds him 1,000 years. He puts him in there, etc., etc. He can't deceive the nations during this 1,000-year period. And then he sees thrones, and he sees people sitting on these thrones, and judgment is given to these people. I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus. Now, one of the things that will be important when we get to the end of this theory is for us to realize what we just read. And some of the words we read when we're going through Revelation 20 tell us the picture. It's just we usually read them too fast. We don't sit and think about what we're reading. But it says he sees, does he see people? Does he see their bodies sitting in the flesh on the thrones? No. It says he saw the souls of the ones who were beheaded for the witness of Christ. So that's a key point that will make sense later on. So just note that he's not seeing them in their bodies sitting on these thrones. He's seeing their souls sitting on the thrones. The ones that were beheaded for their witness, the martyrs. These had not worshipped the beast. They didn't receive the image of the beast. And they lived and reigned with Christ on these thrones in heaven for 1,000 years, while Satan is bound. Verse 5, the rest of the dead then lived not again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. So now we're getting into our topic here, the first resurrection. So you have to ask yourself, there's a couple things about this specific verse, and I've mentioned these before, but the first part of this verse, but the rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years was finished, is not in the earliest manuscripts. And that doesn't mean it's totally invalid. It just means that the earliest manuscripts we have, they don't represent this part of the verse. Seems like it may have been an addition later on, maybe for Christians to have a better understanding. Maybe the people that translated, put these down, copied these, added this as an addendum so that people would understand better. That's the best we can do at this point as far as I guess. But it says this is the first resurrection. What is it talking about then? It's talking about generally everything we just read. The first resurrection where there are the souls of the martyrs reigning on thrones in heaven with Jesus Christ. First resurrection. Now we read a little further, and it says in verse 6, blessed and holy is he that has part in the first resurrection, because, and this is another key point, on the people that take part in the first resurrection, the second death will have no power. So we have to ask ourselves, what's the second death? And it's actually explained further on in this passage. And that is at the very end. It says, verse 14, death, and it's talking about Thanatos and Hades, demonic angels that rule the underworld. They are cast into the lake of fire at the end of this passage after a lot of prophetical things have happened. And it says that's the second death. And this is agreed upon by scriptures and Christian writings. The lake of fire is the second death. Those whose spirits, souls, bodies, whatever, are cast into the lake of fire in the second death, that's it. Gone. Okay, so that's the end. So this is important for us to understand that when it says those who have part in the first resurrection, the second death has no power. They don't go into the second death, obviously, because as it was explaining in the 1,000 years, this is saints, right? This is the souls of saints that he sees reigning on thrones. But just be aware that just because we see souls of saints in heaven, that's not all that may be included in the first resurrection. Okay, so I'm throwing all these ideas out to prep you for what's coming down the pike. So that's what Revelation chapter 20 says. Okay, so during the 1,000 years, there were the souls of the martyrs who had been killed for their faith, reigning on thrones with Christ in heaven, and that they had taken part. They had taken part in the first resurrection. So these are all clues that will help us later, all right? And that these people, whoever is part of the first resurrection, definitely will not be a part of the second death, okay? All right. So with that preparation, that understanding of that passage, which is the best we can do. It doesn't go into a lot of detail on all these things. Let's go into a few other things, because one of the things that's important is to understand what happens when people die, because that's what we're talking about. What happens when people die? That's the key crux of the resurrection of these people that are reigning in heaven. What we're trying to figure out is, when were they taken to heaven? When were they resurrected? When will people in the future be resurrected? When will you and I be resurrected? What happens after we die that matches these things, that matches all of these things? So that's what we're looking for. So we're going to go to a few verses that just talk about kind of the what happens when you die topic, okay? So coming back to our scriptures, we're going to Revelation chapter 14. And if I'm not mistaken, about verse 13 here. Now, it's talking in chapter 14, in the first part of the chapter, it's talking about the judgment of the Lamb. And you may ask, who is getting judged? And you see here that it's talking about Babylon being fallen, Babylon being Rome. So Babylon being fallen, this is the woman on the beast. If anyone drinks the wine of the wrath of God, it's poured out, etc., the smoke of their torment will ascend forever. All these different things. And here's the patience of the saints, verse 12. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. So the righteous, the holy, the followers of Christ. I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, write. Now this is to John, who is writing this vision down. The angel, or this voice from heaven says, write this down. Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth. Of course, John writing this down in my opinion, around 65 AD. Blessed are the dead that die in the Lord henceforth. Yea, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their works follow them. Okay, so this statement, not giving us a lot, but at least saying that the intention of God with people that die, the righteous that die, henceforth from times where his judgment starts on earth and goes forward in time, that they would rest from their labors. Now, what we do know from earlier writings, if you read like the book of Enoch and you look at some of the things that are said in the Old Testament about the dead sleeping in Hades, you know that the natural order of things prior to Christ was that people would die and they would go into Hades, both the righteous and the wicked. But the righteous had a place there that was set aside for them that was not like destructive or oppressive. No discipline, no punishment there. It was a waiting place. But there was another, of course, place in Hades that was for the wicked, and that was more of a punishment type place. So anyway, the idea before Christ is that people, all that die, go to Hades. But this is saying something different. That doesn't sound like rest from your labor. That's essentially imprisonment, waiting, okay? Or sleep, so to speak, as the Old Testament talks about it. So this seems to be a little different. Let's go to another passage. So 2 Corinthians. This is where Paul says, therefore we are always confident, knowing while we are at home in the body, we're absent from the Lord. We walk by faith, not by sight, and says, we are confident, I say, willing rather to be absent from the body and present with the Lord. This is the passage that's always lifted up in front of people whenever a Christian is asked, well, where does a Christian go when he dies? Well, they'll say, well, Paul said if you're absent from the body, you're present with the Lord. Christ, meaning. And so this is what most Christians will give you as an answer. It's not a very detailed answer. It doesn't tell you anything. Other than the idea that you would be at some level with the Lord after death. So this doesn't really help very much. It may be true, and we'll find out more about this later, but it really doesn't give us much information. So let's go to the next passage. So in 2 Timothy chapter 1, let's see. Here we go. Now we're starting to see some verses in the scripture that are talking about what Christ did, saying that he abolished death. Now, in the Greek, this word death is thanatos. And so this is Christ putting down the power of the angel responsible for taking people's souls to hell after they die, or to Hades after they die. Verse 10 here says, but is now made manifest by the appearing of our Savior Jesus Christ, who has abolished death and has brought life and immortality to light through the gospel. So this being written by Paul in the 40s, 50s AD, just after Christ had ascended, saying that Jesus Christ had just abolished death, okay? Put down the power of Hades and the angels that rule that place over the souls of mankind. So that's what we're seeing in this passage. We're going to go to some others that have the same thing in them. Now, I figured I would go further than just the Bible on this one. So Ignatius of Antioch, I can't remember the dates on him. I think it's 2nd or 3rd century. And so he's saying the same kind of thing. From the time forward, and he's talking about the time forward of things hidden from the prince of this world were the virginity of Mary and her childbearing, likewise the death of the Lord. These things were hidden from Satan. He didn't understand them. He wasn't aware. We see in the Gospel of Nicodemus that he talks with Hades, Satan and Hades talking in hell, and Hades is angry at Satan because he allowed Jesus Christ to come down there after death and ruin them, essentially break the gates of Hades open and abolish death, literally. So, this is what he's talking about here in Ignatius' letter to the Ephesians, chapter 19. So this is the time he's talking about. He says, from that time when Jesus Christ abolished death forward, every sorcery and spell was dissolved, ignorance of wickedness vanishes. The ancient kingdom was pulled down when God appeared in the likeness of man unto newness of everlasting life, etc., etc. It says, this or thence all things were perturbed because of the abolishing of death was taken in hand. So again, reaffirming what Christ did with death. Death no longer has a hold on you, as some of the songs of Christians sing. or death no longer has power over us. What does that mean? It has a very literal, important meaning for you and the afterlife. So that's what we're learning here. So let's see, in Irenaeus Against Heresies, I just wanted to point out, he says the same kind of thing. Inasmuch as God is invincible and long-suffering, he indeed shows himself to be long-suffering in the matter of correction of man. And by means of the second man, meaning Jesus Christ, the second Adam, he did bind the strong man. Who's the strong man? It's Satan. He bound the strong man. In fact, this is a quote out of the New Testament, so this is not going too far away from the scriptures themselves. He's really quoting it here. He bound the strong man. He spoiled his goods and abolished death, vivifying that man who had been in a state of death. All right? So again, reaffirming, Christ abolished death. We have to understand what that means. He broke the power of death over the human soul. All right? The reason he did, of course, was because he wants us to be with him. So we have to have a way to get out of Hades and not go there or not be forever imprisoned. We need to be able to go to heaven with him. So Jesus Christ had to do something about that. And he broke the power of death. He abolished it. All right. So with that said, there's a couple pseudepigraphal passages that give us a lot of detail about life after death, about resurrection, about what happens after you die. So in 2 Baruch chapter 49 through about chapter 52, we're not going to read all this. I'm going to skim it, try to go as fast as I can here. So Baruch is asking an angel who is a representative of God, okay, in these passages. That's who's talking here. Baruch is talking to the angel who is essentially speaking for God. And he says, in what shape will those live who live in your day, or how will the splendor of those who are after that time continue? Will they resume this form of the present and put on entrammling members involved in evils, or will you perchance change these things which have been in the world, also as the world? So just know that Baruch in these writings, Baruch 1, 2, and 3, this being, I think it's 2nd Baruch, chapter 49 through 52. Baruch is time and time again asking the angel about prophecies and visions, and tell me about this, and then sometimes he gets a vision, then it's explained to him. And so at this point in this passage, he has now heard about the judgments coming on his people, the Jewish people, and he's concerned because the angel is telling him it's going to be the end of this age, and it's going to be essentially the new age of Messiah, the coming age. Okay, and so Baruch is concerned about this because of all the judgment against the Jews and what's going to happen and what's it going to be like in the new age of the Messiah. So that's really what he is asking about here. He's asking about what happens. Will things change? What's it going to be like? So let me skim through. I'm not sure if all these chapters have things we want to read for this right now. All right. So the angel is answering Baruch and says, "Hear, Baruch, this word, for the earth shall then assuredly restore the dead, which it now receives." Okay, so the angel's telling Baruch that in the present time, this is 300, 400 years before Christ, in that time period, the earth now receives all the dead to preserve them. Okay, both their physical bodies and their souls go to Hades, right? Their spirit or soul goes to Hades and awaits the coming Messiah, right? It awaits for something to change so they can leave, because at that time, the power of death, Hades, Thanatos, had not been broken. It was still intact. So when a human soul left the body, when a human soul left the body at death, it went to Hades to await whatever was next, the Redeemer, the Savior, or the final judgment. So he says, it now the earth receives a man after he's dead, and it shall make no change in their form after this age, but as it has received, so shall it restore them. As I delivered them unto it, so also shall it raise them. For then it will be necessary to show the living that the dead have come to life again, and that those who had departed have returned again. It shall come to pass that judgment shall grow strong, and those things which before were spoken of shall come. He's talking here of the last judgment, the great white throne judgment that would occur at the end. So at that time, all the dead will come forth out of the earth. Okay? So that's what's being talked about in this chapter. Chapter 51, let's see. He says, then it shall come to pass when that appointed day has gone by, then shall the aspect of those who are condemned be afterwards changed, and the glory of those who are justified. For the aspect of those who now act wickedly shall become worse than it is, as they will suffer torment. And also the glory of those who have been justified in my law. Remember, he's talking about Israelites with an Israelite. This is Baruch. He's from Israel. He's an Israelite. He's a Jew. And the angel is telling him about his people. So he's answering a lot of the questions in a way he will understand for Israel. He's talking about those who are justified, those who have had understanding, who have planted in their heart the root of wisdom. Then their splendor will be glorified in changes. He's saying to Baruch that at the end, at the final judgment, when all are resurrected, that the just, the righteous, even of Israel who are down there, will be taken up, will be changed. It says their face will be turned into the light of beauty. They will be able to acquire and receive the world that does not die, meaning heaven, which is then promised to them. For over this above all shall those who come then lament, that they rejected my law and stopped their ears. At the time of the final judgment, they will, of course, lament the fact that they did not follow God's instruction. Okay? Let's continue skimming here. So the wicked obviously will end up in torment. But those, it says, who have been saved by their works, the righteous, the just, to whom the law has been a hope, an understanding, an expectation, a wisdom and confidence, shall wonders appear in their time. They will behold the world which is now invisible to them. They will be able to see the spiritual realm. They will behold that world, that cosmos, that earth. And they shall behold the time which is now hidden from them, and time will no longer age them. He's talking, of course, about once they are taken to be with God in the spiritual realm. It says, for in the heights of that world shall they dwell, in heaven. They will be made like angels, made like stars, changed into every form they desire, beauty to loveliness, light to splendor of glory. All of that stuff. There will be a spread before them of the extent of paradise. Okay? So this is obviously heavenly beauty, majesty, all the things they will inherit. The just, the righteous will get those things. Seeing if there's anything more in this passage. It goes on and on about that to reinforce with Baruch that the righteous will be taken care of, even in the age to come that he's hearing about. All right, so the next chapter, 52, should be the last chapter in 2nd Baruch that talks about these things. So Baruch answers and says, how can we forget those of whom woe is then reserved? And why, therefore, do we again mourn for those who die, or weep for those who depart to Sheol? So 53... Now he gets a vision of the cloud with black and white waters. This is a total vision, and it has to do with the history of the Jewish race and all the different parts and pieces of that, both good and bad. And so it's just a huge vision. But this is not about after you die. So what we've seen here in 2nd Baruch is that the angel tells Baruch that you don't have to worry about it in this age or the age to come, but in this current time period, he says, the dead are going to Hades, and the earth is preserving them for things like the judgment. Okay? All right? So that's what we learned there in 2nd Baruch. So now we're going to go forward to 2nd Esdras. Now this is in 2nd Esdras chapter 7. And let's get back up. I was reading through it, so I scrolled past where I needed to be. So give me 1 second. So Esdras now. Now Esdras, by the way, the book of Esdras is similar to Baruch in that it's Esdras talking with an angel who's representing the Lord, representing God. And so Esdras is grilling the angel back and forth, trying to learn about things, what's coming, what's going to happen. And again, it's a very Jewish context, although I don't think in this passage that's going to matter very much. So here in verse, 16, it says, "Why hast thou not considered in thy mind the thing that is to come rather than that which is present?" The angel's telling Esdras, look forward to the next age. Don't worry about what's happening in this age. And so Esdras answers and says, "Lord, you say and have ordained in the law that the righteous will inherit the things, the ungodly will perish, but the righteous will suffer straight things." Oh, what is it? Let's see. I think I need to go further here just a little bit. So here at this point in 2nd Esdras chapter 7, verse 75, Esdras asks the angel straight out. He says, "If I've found favor in your sight, show this also to your servant, whether after death, as soon as every one of us yields up our soul, we shall be kept in rest until the times come when you will renew the creation." Now, in the first part of chapter 7 here, if you go back and read it, the angel just told Esdras all about the final judgment, all about the undoing of earth, all about the judgment that would come, all about that stuff. And so now he's asking, what then happens after death? As soon as the human dies, where does his soul go? Will we be kept in rest until those times come, until the judgment comes, until you renew the creation? Or he says, shall we be tormented? And he answers me and says, "I will show you that also. But do not include yourself with those who will be tormented, because you won't." He says, "You have treasures stored up with the Most High." He says, concerning death, the teaching is, when the decisive decree is gone out from the Most High that a person will die, as the spirit leaves the body to return again to him who gave it, first of all, it adores the glory of the Most High. It says, such spirits, well, it says then, of the ones who have shown scorn and not kept the way of the Most High. So of the wicked people. When wicked people die, it says, those spirits shall not enter into habitations. We're going to learn more about habitations in just a second. It's a dwelling place, essentially. Such spirits will not enter into habitations or a dwelling place, but they will immediately wander about in torments, grieving and sad. And it tells you a bunch of ways in which they are sad. And then it goes into, now, this is the order of those who have kept the ways of the Most High, the righteous, when they are separated from their mortal bodies. It says, during the time they lived in it, etc., etc., etc. It gives you, and says, first of all, they will see with great joy the glory of him who receives them, and they will have rest in 7 different orders or ways. It tells you all these ways, but the important thing here is in verse 100, it says, Esdras asks, will time therefore be given to souls after they are separated from their bodies to see what you have described to me? And he says, the angel says to him, they will have freedom for 7 days during which they can see these things, and afterwards they will be gathered into their habitations. Now, the habitations here, I'll take a second because I don't think it's going to go into more detail than this in this passage. These habitations are places in heaven. And actually, if we do look back up just a little bit in verse 85, it says that the righteous will be in habitations guarded by angels in profound quiet. That's how it describes these habitations in heaven. They're, I don't know what they are, little houses, little places where Christians, righteous, will go after their death in heaven. And this is apparently to await, gathered into chambers, guarded by angels in profound quiet, and glory waiting for them in the last days. Okay, so that's what they're there for. They will be waiting. We, if we die before the end, will be waiting in heaven. Our souls will be waiting there in heaven. So that's what it's talking about in this passage. So that was always, let me just say that these things are things that I knew. I already knew all these things. In the past, in my studies, I'd run across all this, but I had always had trouble figuring out, well, what does this mean in relationship to Revelation chapter 20, where it talks about the first resurrection and the second resurrection? You know, it seems like when we're talking in Revelation 20 about the saints ruling on thrones with Christ in heaven, which I always have believed that's in heaven. There's no reason to believe anything other than that. The vision is in heaven. He's at the throne of God. He sees it in heaven. So that seems to be heavenly. And that seems to be during the time period when martyrs were being slaughtered for their faith, right? They go to heaven to be reigning on thrones with Christ. In fact, the early Christians wrote those kinds of things. We have Polycarp saying that exact thing, that he wanted to die in service to Christ as a martyr so that he could go and reign with him in heaven. So this is what he was talking about, what we just read in Esdras and Baruch. Being gathered by Christ after death, your soul being taken to heaven to wait in habitations with him until the final judgment, until he comes back, until the great white throne and the events of the end of the earth. So I knew all that, but again, what is the first resurrection versus the second resurrection? Now, I think in my head, I'd always assumed the second resurrection, if we are to use that term. It's not actually said in the scriptures that there's a second resurrection. We only see that mention of a first resurrection. But if we are to assume there's a second resurrection, I would assume that's the final resurrection. There's after the great white throne judgment, that resurrection, that's obviously the last of any resurrection, because then all of humanity will have been resurrected. Okay, at the end, the great white throne, when every knee will bow in before God and before Christ at the judgment seat. That is exactly what will happen at that time, and every human will be resurrected prior to that. So there's obviously no resurrection after that. So if there is a second resurrection, that must be it, and we call that in eschatology the general resurrection of all mankind. So what is the first resurrection? So, based on my previous studies, and I had been kind of preteristic in some of my eschatology prior to in the years ago. And so in that time I was thinking, well, was there some kind of a resurrection when he was raised from the dead? And interestingly enough, when we read in, for instance, the Gospel of Nicodemus, which talks about the time when Christ died and went to Hades at his death, and so between his death and his resurrection, Christ went to Hades, broke the gates down, released the captives, set them free. And in the Gospel of Nicodemus, it actually says that many of those, or all of them, the righteous, Adam, Moses, Abraham, all the righteous who had died prior to his coming, were taken out and taken to heaven with him. Or taken to heaven, rather, by the angel Michael, is what the text says. So we see in that book, Gospel of Nicodemus, where it sounds like there was a resurrection, right? There were a lot of people in Hades that went up to heaven. So that obviously was a resurrection. So is this the first resurrection? And then the question comes, well, it says that also these martyrs took place in the first resurrection. Well, they obviously all didn't die before Christ went to Hades. So that would have happened afterwards. There were plenty of martyrs from the time after Christ was resurrected and ascended. Many Christians died for their faith over even the next few years. In the first century and into the following centuries, we know of many, many martyrs over the first few centuries after Christ. So the question is, well, what resurrection are those guys a part of? Do they just wait around for the final resurrection? Where did they go? Is the book of Baruch and the book of Second Baruch, Second Esdras, are they correct that those guys will go to heaven and wait for the final? Or did they take part in some kind of first resurrection? Or it's just very confusing. None of it just didn't all fit together for me. I couldn't put all the pieces together. Until now. And the until now is today. I was studying, what was I studying? I was generally studying just eschatology all across the board, and I was going into the writings of Sir Isaac Newton, because he has a lot of writings that I am just now understanding. He has tons of writings on eschatology. Isaac Newton, in fact, it looks like he was more prolific on eschatology than he was on almost anything else he wrote about, at least from what I can tell so far. So I've been trying to map out his eschatology and what he believed about all the things that we talk about in eschatology in the book of Revelation. And I found some interesting statements from one of his writings. So that writing, I'll put it on the screen. The writing is called, it's a small, I think it's a letter or a small writing. It's called The Synchronisms of the Three Parts of the Prophetic Interpretation by Sir Isaac Newton. And so this is the quote that I pulled out that tells you what we need to hear in this case, that gave me the light bulb moment. Okay? Gave me the light bulb moment on the first and second resurrection. So he says, "'Tis a received opinion that the general judgment begins at the end of the 1,000 years, and this opinion is deduced from the prophet saying that the martyrs and saints lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years, but the rest of the dead lived not till the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection." So he's generally just about quoting Revelation chapter 20 in that section. He says, this is the first resurrection, but this ground will fail if either the resurrection, now he's just kind of throwing out things that he knows from other Christians, like ideas on this. He's going to say at the end that don't want to enter a dispute about these opinions. So he's just sharing opinions with you that are out there. He actually doesn't answer the questions himself. But in sharing these opinions, he gave me a golden nugget. He says, this ground will fail. The ground standing that, the judgment was going to happen at the end of the 1,000-year binding of Satan, that it was going to happen right at the end. He says, well, but this will not work if the resurrection is considered to be mystical, like that of the two witnesses that some people maintain. Apparently, some people in his time thought that the two witnesses were symbolic or mystical and not really like going to be physical or literal. He says also that this idea of the judgment right at the end of the 1,000 years will not work if the first or second resurrection be from the first and second death respectively. And that was when the light bulb went off for me. Okay. All right. So that's when the light bulb went off. So let's talk about this for a second. So what he just said was the idea or possibility. He's not saying he holds that position, but he's saying it's an idea some people have and they talk about, but he wasn't sure. But he says, if the first and second resurrection is essentially, each resurrection is to escape from the first or second death, respectively. So he's saying there's possibly a relationship in this view between the first resurrection and the first death. The first death, of course, being the death of your body, and the second resurrection and the second death. The second death being you being thrown in Hades, or excuse me, the lake of fire, okay, for destruction, okay, final destruction. That's what happens at the Great White Throne Judgment. So the second death happens at the Great White Throne Judgment. So if the first resurrection is related to the first death, meaning when you die, your body dies, it stands to reason that what's called the first resurrection is when your soul goes, prior to the final judgment, you die and your soul goes to be with Christ in heaven to await the final judgment, just as 2nd Baruch and 2nd Esdras said. So if that's true, that works for what happened in the Gospel of Nicodemus. All the people that, since Adam, that were imprisoned in Hades, even the righteous, when Christ went down there at his death and broke the gates down and abolished the power of death over the human soul, the human souls that were righteous, that were in there, he had Archangel Michael deliver to heaven at that moment. Now they are in heaven, as Esdras and Baruch said, they are in heaven awaiting the final judgment and the new heaven and the new earth, and then the reign of Christ with humanity on earth in the new heaven, new earth. So all those people were part of what we call the first resurrection. And if I was to die today, right now, and my soul goes to be with Christ in heaven to await the final judgment, that will be my first resurrection. By the way, the word resurrection in both Greek and in Hebrew, if it's used in Hebrew, it's usually not talked about much in Hebrew. But that word means rising. It's that simple, the rising. And of course, this is what the Sadducees disagreed with. They didn't actually like much spiritual talk. The Sadducees were kind of materialistic. And so they denied spiritual things. They denied the resurrection because it's a spiritual thing. It happens after you die. The first resurrection is when your spirit is taken to heaven to await final judgment, to await the new heaven and new earth. The second resurrection talked about, or that is implied by Revelation chapter 20, would be the general resurrection of all mankind. So the reality is that anyone that has died since Christ has taken part in the first resurrection, including Adam and Abraham and Moses and Noah, all that have died. They were resurrected. Their souls were resurrected to heaven, risen to heaven. And they are now awaiting, just like every other person who's died since Christ, they are all waiting until the final judgment at the last days. And the second resurrection is when Christ appears in the sky and the heavens are torn wide open and the earth is remade and the great white throne judgment occurs. Because for everyone to stand trial, that must stand trial at that judgment, all the dead will be resurrected before him. At that time, we will all get our bodies. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 talks about the bodies that will be received at resurrection, at that resurrection. We don't get bodies at the first resurrection. We get bodies at the final resurrection, the second resurrection. The first resurrection essentially is our escape from the first death, the death of the body, and then going to Hades. So the first resurrection, when we are taken to heaven, we have escaped now the binding grip of the prison of Hades because of Christ. And the second death, we can escape by the second resurrection, the general resurrection, if we're righteous. That's why it says in Revelation 20 there, we read that said, those who have part in the first resurrection will escape the second death. Why? Because they are the righteous. They are the ones who have followed Christ. They are the ones who are just before God. So they've already been taken in the first resurrection to be with him. And they're awaiting the new heaven and new earth and all of those great things, all the promises, all the inheritance. So again, the correspondence is what sealed the deal for me and helped me understand this. The first death, your first death, the physical death, when your soul would normally go to Hades, has been changed by Christ. You will now be resurrected. Your soul will be resurrected to heaven to await the final things. And at the final judgment, right before the great white throne, the second resurrection, or the general resurrection of all mankind, will occur, so that all mankind may stand before him in the judgment. Of course, the righteous that have already gone forward will not have to be in that. We will be with Christ in the air, as Second Thessalonians says. First Thessalonians. Yeah, I hate it when I forget things. It's 1 Thessalonians 4:17. That's when we meet him in the air. Those who are righteous, the holy, at the final judgment. We meet him in the air because he arrives and, of course, destroys Antichrist with the brightness of his coming, and then stands in judgment over every man who is resurrected in the second resurrection. So I don't know if I've said it all, but that's what it is. And I ran across this statement, and it's funny that it was in a writing by Isaac Newton, but it wasn't really his viewpoint. He was just telling you a few different viewpoints, and I'm so glad I stumbled across it, because I think, as I've explained it to you, it just makes so much sense. First resurrection is to counteract the first death. Second resurrection is to counteract the second death. It just makes a lot of sense. So I'd like to hear what you guys think. I think that I've explained it pretty well, but it is a working theory. As time goes on, I will check this theory against things that I read, against things I find. I will say that in general, I haven't, in all of my studies, and I've read a lot of writings, I haven't seen much that talks about this. So that's why it was so groundbreaking to find this little nugget in Sir Isaac Newton's writing. But I think it has shed some light on what might be considered the first resurrection versus the second. So let me know what you think, and thank you for your time. God bless.